Really good to be with you this morning. My wife a couple of months ago bought some cheese and she said, "This cheese isn't as good." I said to her, "Is it Bega cheese?" And it wasn't Bega cheese, so problem solved. It's a pleasure to be in the capital of where Bega cheese is from, and good to see so many of you here as well. Do you have any pirates in this area? Any pirates around here? Depends what you define as pirates. Have any of you met or seen or encountered a pirate? Nobody yet? Someone's pointing to his sister. She's not a pirate. Did you know there are more pirates alive today than ever before in history? If you combined all the pirates that have ever lived in the last 6,000, 7,000 years, more of them are alive today than all of those combined. Were you aware? Fly by plane, don't take a boat. There are pirates out there. What sort of pirates? Have a look at what a news article wrote. Australians have become the world's worst internet pirates. Have you met a pirate now? Have you heard of pirates? What's an internet pirate? What do? They download things off the internet that they haven't paid for, right? Haven't paid for it. What kind of things do they download? Because none of you know what that is, but you've heard of them, right? Music, what else? Movies, games, things like that, right? A couple of years ago, there was a movie that came out, and not that any of you would know what this is all about, but it was a niche movie. It's not the kind of movie that everybody rushes to, because it's weird, sort of apocalyptic. Only a certain kind of people really like this movie. It's not like an Avengers movie that everybody has to go and see. Within a week of it being released at the cinemas, 3.5 million Australians downloaded it illegally. Now, it wasn't out on DVD yet. It was downloaded illegally because some clever guy took his camera into the cinema and he filmed the movie. And then he put this really low quality movie on the internet, and 3.5 million Australians thought it was a great idea to watch it. That's not even a mainstream movie. The Avengers and other ones, you're talking maybe 10 million people. The good thing about piracy is that it doesn't discriminate based on gender. Men and women do it, right? Equality. 1 in 4 people in Australia, we have the highest rate, 1 in 4 people are internet pirates in Australia. So we're going to do a little thought experiment. 1, 2, 3. I'm not implying anything, but 1 in 4 people are internet pirates. The place with the world's worst internet piracy, the city with the world's worst pirates in Australia. Does anyone recognize that one? Yes. Live there. The most livable city in the world also has the most pirates. Now, how do governments feel about internet piracy? How do you think the Australian federal government feels about people who pirate things off the internet? Are they happy with it? Why are they not happy with it? Governments love what? They love people. And the only way to look after people is with money. And the only way they get money is through taxes. Governments hate taxes. They love people. Don't forget that, right? You heard it in church, first from me. And they're really disappointed when they can't love you and I enough because they don't have enough tax revenue. And when people download things illegally, they're not paying things like GST. Companies are not making profits because they're not making as many profits. Not as many taxes are paid. So the Australian government, like other governments, has tried to come up with a solution to internet piracy. And the solution is to create what's called a filter or a blocker so that when you go to a website that allows you to download things illegally, you get a message that says, this website has been blocked by the Federal Parliament of Australia, right? So for example, what's a website that promotes internet piracy? A really famous one. Does anyone know it? Have you heard of it? Because you haven't been there. Come on, I'm sure you've heard of it. The Pirate Bay. If you typed in the Pirate Bay into your phone right now, it would say this website is blocked. Now, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017, these laws first came out. And when the filter was applied, within 24 hours, there was an article on ABC News. Now, who is supposed to run ABC? It's a government-funded news outlet, right? There was an article on ABC News, how to get around the internet filters. Do you think they've been able to kill piracy off? They haven't been able to. Why is piracy so difficult to kill? If there was a nation promoting piracy, what would we collectively do as a global village to that particular nation? What would we do to them? If, let's say, all of piracy came out of Afghanistan, what would we do to Afghanistan? That would be the nuclear option, right? Yeah. But before we got to bombs, let's tone it down a little bit. Before we got to bombs, we'd probably do what? Sanctions. You can't buy and sell. That has an interesting ring to it. Okay, and then eventually maybe we might even cut their internet cables, right? So they can't access the internet, and then maybe one day, eventually, no, we won't go to bombs yet. Right? If it was a company or corporation, what could we do to that company or corporation? You arrest the CEO, you arrest the executives, you stop it from trading, you put a fence around it, put a lock. But what's the problem with piracy? Is it a nation or a corporation? It's something that, and Dragon alluded to this earlier, P2P, person to person, peer-to-peer. That's probably more the technical word for it. How do you stop 3 billion people sharing things on the internet without stopping the internet? You see, one of the greatest forces known to humanity is not the sword. It's not even the newspaper or propaganda. It's not even nuclear weapons. You know, if I want things to go from the conference to our churches, I put it in a newsletter, and I send an email out, and I pick up the phone and I ring pastors, and we talk to elders, and I communicate till I'm blue in the face, and then I come to a local church and the members say what? Never heard about it, right? But if I come up to someone and say, I'm going to tell you something, but don't tell anybody else, right? By the time I go back to my desk about 3 minutes away, I get a phone call from like Broken Hill. Are you with me? The person-to-person network has done more good and had more challenges. It's stronger than anything else known to humanity. How does the person-to-person concept work for us as a church? How do we utilize and harness that in terms of our mission, in terms of our focus, in terms of who we are? I'm going to share with you a Bible story about the power of person-to-person, peer-to-peer, the impact, the influence that it can have. First, we're going to look at a nation that could not be conquered by conventional means, and then find out how P2P transformed that nation forever. But we're going to start where all good stories start, and that's with Lego. Does anybody recognize the gentleman on the screen? Yes, who is it? Ooh, very close. Same part of the world. I'm impressed. Anyone else? He said Hercules, roughly around the same area. Who was that? Alexander the Great. Now that one's for the children, this one's for the adults. Alexander the Great. What do we know about Alexander? How much of the world did he conquer? All of it. Who tells us he conquered all of it? Alexander tells us he conquered all of it. And so we believe what? That he conquered all of it. There's the famous legend that he gets to the edge of India and he starts crying. Why is he crying? There's nothing left to conquer. Who came up with that legend? Now, Alexander had a group of historians that would travel with him everywhere he went. And they would record what happened. And every time that things didn't go so well for Alexander, what would happen? He'd go to his historians and say, oh, mate, you guys have been working hard. Why don't you take the next couple of weeks off? Don't worry about this one. I got it. Right? The Greeks wrote their own history. Everything we know about them comes from them. Did you know there was a nation that they couldn't conquer? And in their records, they said, we don't even know who they are because we didn't even pass by. But we have some other records from other nations that tell us a very different story. It was this nation. Alexander has his army, and they face off with the enemy. And when Alexander takes one look at the enemy, he looks at his Apple Watch, and he says, "Oh my, it's time for afternoon tea." And they just march off and don't even engage in battle. Why not? Because the battle looked a little bit like this. Now, if you haven't guessed already, this is who? This is the biggest guy in Alexander's army, right? And this is the enemy that he is opposing. Smart man, Alexander, wasn't he? He knew when to call it quits, and he told his historians, don't write about this. And they didn't, but the other nation did write about it and tell us what happened. You see, it was a David and Goliath battle, only Alexander didn't have any Davids. He decided it was smart to move on. Another Lego character. Anyone recognize this gentleman? On the money. 2 out of 2. This is the first place I've ever been to where we've had 2 out of 2. Julius Caesar. Well, this is a Lego character of Julius Caesar. He had a nephew by the name of Augustus, or Octavian, who gave himself the name Augustus. Because, I mean, you know, when you become important, you change your name from Bob to the Great One. Right? The August one. Now, Augustus, he was probably a little bit more like me growing up. He was, you know, he liked to play, but he wasn't really the big, brawny, tough guy, you know. When we used to play sport at school, they would make me the finish line, right? Because nobody wanted me on their team. I would be the referee, I'd keep score, because I just didn't have the physical presence for that sort of stuff. That's what Octavian was like. You can understand why he called himself the Great One, right? A bit of insecurity. So he sends his army. He's not like Alexander. He doesn't go into battle like Alexander. He sent his army into battle to face off against the same nation that Alexander ran away from. His army goes. They fight. They come back a couple of months later to Rome, and the Rome Daily Telegraph says, we went, we saw, we made a peace treaty. That's what it actually says. They made a peace treaty. Now, when do the Romans ever make peace treaties? Well, except for when they're what? When they're scared. That's a really good answer. And they were scared. They fought. They lost pretty much every battle and decided, oh, let's just sign a peace treaty. Yeah, that's right. And we'll go home and forget this ever happened. Who was this nation that the Greeks and the Romans, two of the mightiest empires that ever lived, could not conquer? It was the nation of this particular woman. Does anybody recognize her? Be louder. Anyone? She's from the Bible. I'll give you another clue. What about now? You got to go get your children some Bible cartoons. I'll give you another look at it. Does anybody recognize this character? Okay, so if that's Moses, who's that next to him? Zipporah. Now, I grew up, well, I came, you heard, as a refugee to Australia, and I had never seen a TV in my life before until we get to Australia, and TVs are an incredible thing, right? And so we get a TV, but there are rules for television watching. Right? As all good parents do, you can't watch all day. You can only watch Lassie. Do you remember Lassie? Because that was clean. Lassie and Skippy. You know, Skippy was a bit more violent, but, you know, we got away with it. And on Sabbath, you couldn't watch anything except for, what could you watch on Sabbath? Bible movies, right? How many Bible movies were there in 1987? I'll tell you how many Bible movies there were. 1. Right? Well, there was 2, but one was probably a bit more violent. But there was one main one, and it was, what movie? The 10 Commandments. Do you guys remember 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston? Yeah? And so every single Sabbath, what are we doing? There's only one thing you can watch, right? Your parents are having, you know, lay activities, and your kids, and you've drawn to death, and you've colored in every coloring in book you've got, and you've read the Bible a few times, so it's time to put on the 10 Commandments. I knew this movie so well that we'd go to Sabbath school, and the Sabbath school teacher would say, so, what happened here in the life of Moses? I had no idea what the Bible said. I would always quote the movie, right? And so you watch that movie, and you see Moses, and you see Zipporah, and Zipporah is this, you know, attractive British supermodel. which is exactly how the Bible describes her, right? How is she described in the Bible? Well, she was a shepherdess to start off with, right? She looked after sheep in a pretty rugged part of the world. And if you go to Numbers chapter 10, it tells us that she was not a Snow White. She was much darker in complexion, it actually tells us. And there was a bit of racism because Miriam and Aaron, they don't like the fact that, Moses has a cross-cultural marriage, right? That's nothing new. That was way back then. What do we find about her? The Bible tells us she's from Midian. Now, there are a couple of Midians in the Bible. It's not the Midian that the Israelites, well, it is the Midian that they conquered, but it's not the Midian that appears later. This Midian was also known as Nubia or Cush. And there were people of large stature and dark skin. And there were a people that were led and ruled by, do you want to like to take a guess? By a woman. Now, can you understand why Alexander the Great gave his historians some time off? We were going to fight, but there was a woman in front, and we don't fight with women. Right? He was going to get whooped, and he didn't want to tell anybody that he got whooped by a... Because in those days, it didn't matter who the army was. It was the general, the person in front that got all the credit. And if they got whooped, he didn't even want the chance that he could be whooped by a woman, so he just ran away. And the Romans, they tried, but they got whooped by... The might of Rome got whooped by the matriarch of the Nubians, of the Cushites, of the Midianites. That's why they made a peace treaty. A good lesson for all men. Peace is better than war, right? What do we know about this particular group of people? This is a part of the world that they're from. It covers several countries, modern countries today: Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, a bit of Ethiopia. What do you notice that is interesting about the map? Now, ignore the red dot, everything else. What are some of the features that stand out? Desert. What's this desert? The Sahara Desert, biggest desert in the world. What else stands out? Desert and? When you think of Africa, do you think of green? Now, if you live there and you've been there, you do. Average people that don't really know a lot about geography, when they think of Africa, they think more of desert and lack of rain. But Africa is an extremely fertile place. It is one of the richest sources of minerals in the world. Now, if you look a little bit closer, I'll come back here, you've got all this wealth, all these minerals, resources, natural wealth, and you want to trade that with the rest of the world. Because trade is how you make money and how you grow strong. Now, you could try to go by ship, but ships were very expensive and they didn't develop very good shipping for thousands of years. What was the other way to get all the wealth from here up to this part of the world? How would you get it there? You could walk. If you're a bit smarter and wealthier, you'd buy some camels. And if you were here, you would just cross through the desert, right? Because that's the shortcut. Is that what you'd do? Why wouldn't you go through the desert? You'd only go through the desert if you never wanted to see your wife again, right? Now, if you had some common sense and you had a good marriage and you wanted to come back home, what would you do? How would you travel? How would you move goods from the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest regions on earth to trade with the rest of the world? Up the Nile. You've got the largest desert in the world right next to the longest river in the world, up the Nile. And this is Midian or Cush or Nubia. Where do they sit in the grand scheme of things? What do they control? Access to the Nile with the wealth of Africa, basically. Now, the Greeks were so incensed that they couldn't beat this group of people that they gave them a really bad nickname. They didn't call them the Nubians or the Cushites or the Midianites. They said, those are the guys burnt by the sun, right? And so in Greek, char, burnt, or burnt by the sun, the word for it is Ethiopia, which is where we get the word Ethiopian, right? But they weren't called the Ethiopians. So you've got this nation, this extremely mighty, wealthy nation that couldn't be defeated. Now, the first time they make an appearance, a major appearance in the Bible, is in 1 Kings chapter 10. If you want to open your Bibles briefly there, 1 Kings chapter 10. I'm just going to read through that. That's not our main story, but we'll be there in a few minutes. 1 Kings chapter 10. It says from verse 1, when the queen of who? Notice it wasn't the king, because another name for this place was Sheba. When the queen of Sheba heard about the famous Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions, arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, precious stones. She came to Solomon and talked to him about all she had on her mind. This queen from Sheba comes. She brings a lot of wealth. Now, notice the order of the things that she brings in. Order is very important in the Bible, right? As it is today. You go to the shop and you want to buy some cereal for yourself, for your children. What is the first thing you look at before you put something into your shopping trolley? I look at the price, right? But if you're not me, if you're a normal person, what do you look at? And how do you know what percentage there is in your product? What's a really quick, easy way to know what there is most of? Whatever's first, right? And so you're about to put a packet of no-no pops in the trolley, and the first ingredient is sugar. And you say, this is great. Fill it up. It's on special. Going to give my kids lots of energy, right? Of course not. Here it says that what did she bring? What does it say she brought first? It doesn't say gold, does it? It doesn't say precious stones. Had plenty of those. Spices. This part of the world controlled one of the largest spice routes, one of the largest spice stores in the world. And spices were more precious than gold, especially for the Jews, because the Jews ate what sort of meat? Kosher meat. How many of you have ever tasted kosher meat? Yeah? A few of you have. For those of you that haven't tasted kosher meat, what does kosher meat mean? The blood's been drained, right? There's no blood in it. If you want to know what kosher meat tastes like, just take your shoe off and just give it a bit of a taste, right? Because this is called kosher meat, right? So what do you do to make your shoe taste better? You add tomato sauce, right? I'm in Australia. Tomato sauce fixes everything. If you lived back there, you didn't have tomato sauce, you just added spices to everything, and that way it made the food palatable. And then it says gold and all those other things. You see, this region was wealthy in spices, in gold, in precious stones, in ivory, in exotic animals. It was an incredible place. Everybody wanted to conquer the Ethiopians. And how many were successful? None, until we get to our story. Here's our main story. Acts chapter 8. Open your Bibles there. Acts chapter 8. New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Acts chapter 8. And we're just reading from verse 26 onwards. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. What do we know about Philip? Who's Philip? What does Philip do for a living? What's his day job? What does he do? He's a disciple of Jesus, and what does he do as a disciple of Jesus? He goes around and does what? Tells people about Jesus. We would call him an evangelist. So Philip is an evangelist. Day in, day out, he tells people about Jesus. He is really busy telling people about Jesus because Jesus is coming soon. And you've got to tell more people to be ready because Jesus is coming soon. In the middle of his busy schedule, remember, this guy doesn't sit around at home on Facebook playing Fortnite, trying to figure out what to do with himself. He's telling people about Jesus. In the middle of this busy day, the first divine appointment in this story, an angel appears to him. What does the angel say? Go for a walk in the desert. Wouldn't that kind of wreck your schedule? You know, you drive in, you're about to hop off out of the car into your office to do some important work, and God says, go bush. But you know what? Philip doesn't argue. When an angel speaks to you, you don't argue. You do what you're told. So what does Philip do? So he started out, and on his way, he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake, queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. So Philip is traveling. He's walked for hours through the desert. How is he feeling right about now? Pretty hot, sweaty, dusty. Didn't have the kind of conditions we have, with closed shoes and, a camel backpack to drink water out of. It's hot, sweaty, a bit tired. On his way, what does he see in the distance? The CFO, or the treasurer of Ethiopia. What do we know about Ethiopia now? One of the wealthiest countries on earth. They're wealthy and undefeated. And he sees them in a distance. Remember, what is Philip's full-time job? He's an evangelist. He's been in the desert. How many people has he been able to witness to in the desert? No one. So his job satisfaction has just dropped to an all-time low. But now in the distance, what does he see? Now, do you think, like our caricature before and like what we see in children's cartoons, do you imagine this Ethiopian treasurer in a one-horse chariot holding the reins with one hand and reading from Isaiah with the other hand? Is that what you think was happening? What was likely happening? He had an entourage. He had a caravan of chariots, and he's probably sitting in the biggest, wealthiest one. And for his status, he's probably not being drawn by horses, because that would be beneath him. He's probably being carried in his little cubicle up the top, right? There could be hundreds of people with this guy. Philip sees at least dozens. I don't want to put a number to say hundreds, because we don't know, but it was probably a very large entourage for the importance of this man, right? So this is what Philip sees. He's an evangelist. People, what would be the natural reaction for an evangelist when he sees people that he hasn't been able to talk to for like 5 hours because he's been walking in the desert? What do? Finally, someone to talk to witness to tell them about Jesus. And what does Philip do? Let's actually read and find out what Philip does. Nothing. Is that in your Bible as well? What do you find between verse 28 and 29? Okay, so an angel tells Philip to go to the desert. He's been here for hours. He sees people. Wouldn't it be normal that the Spirit wouldn't need to tell him anything? But the Spirit, this is a second divine intervention, the Spirit has to actually go and tell Philip, verse 29, go to that chariot. Now, here's something that, I don't know whether it's humorous or interesting. I find it a bit humorous. The Spirit doesn't just say, go next to the chariot. Should God have had to say that to him? Like you go to the park, you take your kids to the park, there are other kids there, and you've got to tell your kids, go play with them. That's not normal, right? The Spirit has to tell Philip, and then what else does he say? Don't just go to the chariot. What else should you do, Philip? Why does God, in his infinite wisdom and in his incredible busyness, have to tell Philip not just to go, but to actually stay near it? Do you think he needs that level detail of instruction? I can imagine if the Spirit just told Philip to go near it, you know what Philip would have done? He would have gone for a quick run, close to it, and then turned around and curtailed back into the desert. Why? We discover through the book of Acts that the early Christians were predominantly Jewish, and they had a bit of a problem. What was their problem? They were racist and bigoted and prejudiced. And so the Spirit has to get Philip to go for a walk through the desert. Then he has to say, go next to it. Then he has to say, don't just go near it, but stick around, Philip. Now you understand why God made him walk through the desert for so long. Verse 30, then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. Do you understand what you're reading? Philip asked. How can I? So he, this is the Ethiopian treasurer, invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Would a Jew likely have sat with the person of another race in the same chariot? No, but God has worn him out, hasn't he? He's had to walk through the desert for hours. And he's so tired that finally, all right, I'll sit next to you because you are reading the Jewish scriptures and maybe this is why God sent me here. Maybe, just in case, right? I'm not sure, but, the angel, the Spirit, let's do that. So they have a Bible study, and it's not a very long Bible study. You can read it there. As they traveled along, verse 36, the eunuch wants to get baptized. Verse 39, when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again. Did you just catch that? How did Philip get here? He had to walk through the desert for hours and hours and hours. When he finishes his mission, what does the Spirit decide to do magically? Why didn't he beam him down the same way he was beamed up? Because he wouldn't have got into the chariot, right? He wasn't tired enough. He would have stayed at a distance and maybe never been able to give this Bible study. You see, God does everything for a purpose. Next time he makes you walk through the desert, don't complain. Just realize maybe he's doing this for my good and for the salvation of others. And when he gets beamed up and he goes to Azotus, what does he do the moment he gets beamed down into Azotus? What does it say he does? What does he do? When he goes to Azotus, this is Philip. When he gets to Azotus, verse 40, Philip, however, appeared at Azotus. This is where he gets beamed down and traveled about preaching the gospel. Oh, wait, now where there are Jews, he can preach the gospel, but when he sees Ethiopians, he's not good at preaching the gospel. You see, we make this story often about the Ethiopian. Who is this story really about? It is about Philip. It is about his experience. Because in Philip's mind, the gospel is about sharing information. Could God have given the Ethiopian some skywriting with the gospel? Could he have just miraculously dropped a book in his lap that gave him all the answers? Could he have done that? Why didn't he? Why didn't God just drop the information down? What was he trying to teach Philip? The information is only as valuable as the relationship. And the information leads to relationships. And the information is all about relationships. What good is all of the information we have if not to develop, to generate, to create better relationships? You go to Ethiopia today, you'll find that Ethiopia was one of the first official Christian nations. When the second most important person in the country comes back and starts telling people about Jesus, that has an impact. If you go to Ethiopia today, you'll be able to see churches built in the 2nd and 3rd century. Some of the oldest Christian churches we have come from Ethiopia. The Greeks couldn't conquer Ethiopia. The Romans couldn't conquer Ethiopia. What conquered Ethiopia? And it wasn't just the gospel. It was the gospel through another person. Could God have sent an angel to talk to the Ethiopian? Can you imagine that? God already sends an angel to tell Philip to go. Wouldn't the angel have done a better job than Philip? You bet. When Philip sees this entourage and he still doesn't want to go, wouldn't it have been better then to send an angel? 3 times God intervenes divinely. For what purpose? Because it wasn't just about information. Information is to create, to build, to enhance, to develop relationships. Last verse we're going to read together. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 20. I assume that most of us are familiar with this story. If you're not, have a read through it at home. Joseph is about to get married. He discovers that his fiancée is pregnant. He doesn't remember being in the vicinity when this happened. He wants to leave her. Verse 20, but after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Then it continues, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, in those times, if you want to repeat something, you would say the same concept using different words, right? You didn't have bold font. You couldn't make it bigger. You couldn't put sparkles around it. You couldn't send an emoji. So you just repeated things again and again. So Jesus means what? Save people from their sins. But his name is also what else? Emmanuel, which is? So to be saved from sin means the same thing as God with us. What is sin? Give me the biblical definition of sin. Transgression of the law, 1 John chapter 3 and verse 8. Which law? God's law? Which one? Matthew 22, 38 to 40. What is God's law? What is the foundation of all of God's law? Love God, love others. So what is sin? To not have good relationships with God and with others. So what did Jesus come to save us from? Bad relationships with God and with others. That's why to be saved from sin is to have God with. It's a restoration of relationships. All of the information, all of the truth, all of the doctrines that we have are all about what? Better relationships with God and with each other. Why do we need salvation? When God comes in the Garden of Eden after we ate fruit, where were we? Running. What have we been doing to each other ever since? Hurting each other. What is salvation? Restoration of those relationships. You know, I travel a lot for work. Most Sabbaths I'm away. People say, you know, tell me about your relationship with your wife. What's your relationship like? And I say, it is fantastic. They say, how? I say, well, we haven't killed each other yet. I haven't stolen from my wife for like 3 years. You see, we often describe our relationships with each other in the kind of things. What makes a good relationship? The things you don't do to each other? I've never cheated on my wife. We have a fantastic marriage. Is that what makes a good marriage? What makes a good marriage? It's the things you do with and for each other. That couple said, you know, the secret to our marriage is we do dinner twice a week. He goes on Mondays, I go on Wednesdays. So what makes a good marriage? You see, and often we have descended to describe salvation and our Christian experience about all of the things we don't do. Hey, why don't you come for drinks at the pub on Friday night? We're celebrating so-and-so's birthday. I don't go to the pub. I don't drink. And Friday night is my Sabbath. Sabbath? What Sabbath? Sabbath is an incredible day. On Sabbath, we don't work. We don't watch TV. We don't play. We don't do Facebook. On Sabbath, we don't go to parties. On Sabbath, we don't go swimming. On Sabbath, we don't ride bikes. Sabbath is incredible. Would you like to experience the Sabbath with us? We describe salvation with all the things we don't do. And I cannot wait to get to heaven. Because when I get to heaven, I'm going to say, so how many years since you last swore? I haven't sworn for 3 billion years. What else haven't you? I haven't had chocolate. Oh, no, we don't do chocolate. Heaven is about all of the things we don't do. And Seventh-day Adventists have become the people. We used to be the people of the book. Now we're the people of the don't. Right? And we're so particular about the don'ts that we have amazing intellectual conversations. How deep can you go into the water on the Sabbath? Jesus came to save us, not from all the things we don't do, but to what? To all the things to do, to have better relationships with God and with each other. Philip didn't get that. God had to make Philip go for a walk in the desert and give him several direct instructions on what he should do because he was all about giving information. And we have made the message of the Seventh-day Adventist Church a package to give rather than a package to live. We'll give you the truth. We'll tell you who the beast is. Does it matter if we behave like the beast? Well, no, because I'm not the beast. I can prove it. Look at the Latin numerals. right? Are those things important? Yes, they are. To what degree? To the degree that that information does what? Information is for the sake of better relationships. And you know, as Adventists, we have a complete package to live. What is the Sabbath all about? What was the Sabbath given for? Relationships with who? With God and with each other. Do we want to know if we experience salvation? Ask your children what they think about the Sabbath. And if the Sabbath is a day of don'ts, what do they think about God? What are they experiencing? Why do our children leave the church so quickly and so early on? Because our message is a message of don't. We had a friend come over, he was an atheist, and he said, "Oh, we're doing this on Sabbath, would you like to come?" I said to him, "We would love to come, but we already have something really special planned." And I told him what we had planned with our family. 5 minutes in, he turns to his wife, he's an atheist, and he says, "Maybe we shouldn't go either, we should just have a Sabbath." What is the health message all about? Is it about all the things we can't eat? Is it about living a longer life? Is that why God gave us a health message? Living a longer life? I thought it was for a longer life, and then I thought about it a bit more. What happens if I don't eat chocolate for all of my life, and then when I'm 23, I get hit by a bus? What a waste of life, not having eaten chocolate. It doesn't work, does it? You know why God gives us the health message? What does a healthy body do to our minds? Healthy body? How do we have relationships? With our minds. Any men here ever experienced the man flu? I can say this because my wife's not here. I sometimes hear her talking to other women about childbirth, right? And I don't say anything. I've learned that, right? You don't say anything. They're talking about the challenges and the difficulty, and I'm sitting there thinking, they've never had the man flu. What happens when a man has the man flu? Tell me about your relationship with a man who has the man flu. My wife and I have an agreement. We have a temporary separation when I have the man flu, right? It's the only way to keep our marriage going. Because you turn into a what? A monster, right? Why does God give us a health message? Because God feels sorry for us when we get the man flu. And when we have the man flu, it impacts our relationships. Try talking to someone that's drunk. Everything God has given us, all the information, is for one purpose and one alone. Better relationships with God and with each other. My challenge and my invitation for you is, have you experienced salvation? Have you experienced what God longs to give you? Not a list of all the things you can't do, but all the things God longs to do so that we can have greater joy. Because happiness comes from what? More money in your bank account? And you get it, and then what? Happiness comes from healthy relationships with God and with each other. This coming week, I want to invite you to experience salvation. Think of one relationship that God wants to save. Could be your husband, could be your wife, could be a child, could be a neighbor, could be a church member. Jesus didn't come to give us more do's and don'ts and information that we have to hold and give. Jesus came to make our lives better relationships with Him and with each other. Is there a relationship that could be better that He wants to save in your life? Make that commitment. Lord, save me. What one thing can I do to make that relationship better? What one step can I take with God? Maybe I'm going to choose to dedicate 1 minute to Him every day, because I haven't done anything, but just 1 minute just to say hello to God in the morning. Does He need it? No, He's a big God. He's okay. But we're blessed by having that 1 minute in prayer. That 1 minute reading a thought from Scripture. Maybe it might turn into 5 minutes, but that's okay. Make a connection. Maybe you haven't told your spouse that you love them. Maybe you haven't done something nice for your spouse and you've taken it for granted for ages. Maybe there's a colleague at work that just really irritates you. Maybe praying for them. Maybe taking one more step towards a better relationship. Maybe it's a church member that you still hold a grudge for and you haven't forgiven. It's eating away at you. It's causing pain, problems. It causes tension. Either Jesus is alive or He isn't. And if He is alive, what can He do to that relationship? He can save it. He can heal. He can restore. one relationship this week better. Jesus came to save us, not from things we can't do, but to what we can be and to the relationships we can have.